Which are longer, longswords or katana? Longswords are longer. Okay, until next time, guys. Take care. Oh, you decided to stick around. Great. Well, as you might expect, this is a much more nuanced discussion than it may have sounded. So let's get into it. And why am I holding this, a Chinese sword? Well, we're going to get into the topic discussing two of the most popular types of swords, katana and longsword, and as well as this beautiful sword by L.K. Chen, a Chinese sword that is related to both of them. But before we get there, we're going to have to go over some definitions. So this topic has been born out of the reason I got into this topic has been born out of discussions that I've been having with the Scholar General. Shout out to my good friend Keith. We have been looking at continental swords in mainland China, and specifically about the ratios between the length of the handles and the blade length, and how there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy if we look at the proportions in early Ming era blades compared to later Qing era blades, even when the blades are derived from Japanese swords. And here, if we take a quick look, this is the LK Chen Ming Crossbowman Dao, and you can see immediately that this looks very much like popular shapes of Japanese swords. It has a tonku, a collar that's very much like a Japanese habaki. It has a round husho, the discard that's not unlike a Japanese suba, and it's got a very long grip on it, again reminiscent of Japanese blades. Not to mention the rest of the blade geometry, etc. So looking at these continental swords, that kind of begged the question as to what really was the morphology of Japanese swords in the same time period, and that in turn can be used to compare to what we have going on in Europe. Now, before I get into this, I should preface it by saying I study swords from all sorts of different cultures. However, while I do dabble in swords of all different cultures, I do not profess to be an expert in any type of sword family, if you will. And so I will always defer to folks who spend more of their effort and time, especially those who specialize in one single type of sword design. So anyone who is a collector of Nihonto arts, a lot of this discussion may come as kind of old news to you, and anything that you have to contribute to the discussion, I certainly welcome it. But this is stuff that as I'm reading Sato, or as I'm reading Marcus Sesko, is kind of coming as new material to me, and so I'm sharing that to the class as it were. So the question is, what was longer, a longsword or a katana? I'm actually going to start dropping the term katana, and I'm going to start using the term Daito, Daito meaning longsword, in part because of the time frames that we're looking at. Let's take a quick look at the timeline. Focusing on the use of curved Japanese swords, or wanto, we start their popularity picking up in the late Heian period, or approximately 11th century. Called Tachi at this time, these two-handed Daito go through distinct stylistic changes as they go through the Heian, Kamakura, and Nambukcho period. As we enter the Muromachi period, which includes the time of the warring states called the Sengoku Jidai, the popularity of the shorter Uchikatana begins to increase, finally overtaking the Tachi as the principal sword of war during the 15th century. The naming conventions are very complex, but roughly, the shorter Uchikatana are called shoto, or wakizashi, and the ones over 60 centimeters are eventually called katana. As we enter the Edo period, this katana is the primary daito, or longsword, although tachi are still produced in smaller numbers. In Europe during the same time period, single-handed swords were in use for the entire 600-year time frame. Swords which could be used in one or two hands do show up perhaps as early as the 12th century, and become frequent by the mid-13th century. Called either war swords or great swords of war, these tend to be larger and more cut-centric than those used by fencing masters by the time of Fiore delivery. They do, however, lay the groundwork for the hand-and-half and bastard swords, of the 14th through 16th centuries in the time of both military and civilian longsword fencing. So we've had a little time where we've spent looking at the Japanese side of things, and we kind of defined why we're talking about Daito, and probably spending more time looking at Tachi than Uchikatana. What about longsword? Where does that come from? The term longsword that we use in English, especially in HEMA, mostly comes from German, believe it or not. Even though in English the word longsword was used historically, it could mean a variety of different swords, including things like rapier. Basically, anytime you said longsword, in the distant past, it usually meant a sword that was longer or had a longer blade than whatever was typical in use at the time. Longsword now refers to long sword fencing, Longsword fencing, fencing done with a sword that you can use two hands on, as opposed to single-handed sword fencing, which is, I believe, Kurzschwert. Again, German speakers, please correct me on that. So using an arming sword or even a hand and a half sword or bastard sword in a single hand, that type of fencing technique would be called Kurzschwert or short sword fencing. So the modern technique of practicing with Federschwerts, etc., is a type of long sword fencing, but it doesn't correspond to a specific sword typology. This is part of why it's so difficult to narrow down what is a longsword. Shad has a video discussing this kind of recently. He says, well, what should we compare to a katana? There's longswords that are only this big. There are longswords that are that big. There are big, great swords of war. And as we get into looking at the analyses, we'll find that that is the case. If you map out historical longswords or bastard swords, you'll find that there isn't a very strong cluster of length, either in total length or in just blade length. And instead you find kind of gradual distribution all the way from arming sword up to kind of this standard modern competition length, continuing up into big two-handed swords, continuing way up into Zweihander and field sword size. So back in the day, they were not as fixed and rigid. It's true that if we're looking at Japan, for example, when there were restrictions and rules about sword length, swords were perhaps made more consistently, and there are clusters at certain shaku, or certain sizes of sword, and everything was made either at that length or below it. And so you'll have a cluster of distributions at a certain length and not really above it. That doesn't seem to be true in Europe. In Europe, people could make a sword 28 inches, 29 inches, 30 inches, 31, 32, 33, 34, and there wasn't that much of a predilection for one or the other at a time, or was there? We'll see what the data shows. So before we get into looking at what the data of historical swords were, let's just take a look at what we have right here in front of us to get some idea of a sense of scale of what we have going on. So I don't have a good longsword for us to compare to, so this is just a red dragon synthetic longsword. So we have a blade that is 96 centimeters long, 37 3/4 inch for the Imperials, total length of 124 centimeters, or about 49 inches. Going to put it on the bit of a long end of a spectrum. I think that historical examples we're going to find are closer to that. We probably have an extra 1.5 inches or so on there. If we compare it to my recently reviewed Ronin Katana number 9 rather, with a blade length of a Nagasa of 70 centimeters. Now, here is a point to bring up. When we are looking at the actual historical measurements, katana are measured differently than European blades. Katana are measured from the tip of the kisaki to the edge of where the ha meets the beginning of the nakago here. The motohaba? No, that's not correct. I forget the term. I'll put it on the screen here. But essentially, it stops right here. You can see on this blade, it measures right at 70 centimeters. If we were to measure it in the same way that we would a European blade, showing how much reach you have from the guard, we'd have to measure it all the way to the tsuba, including the length of the habaki. In that case, that gives me an extra 3.2 centimeters. So almost an extra inch and a half of reach, something to consider when we're looking at the historical examples. So this is either a 27.5 or a 28.5 inch blade, depending on how you measure it. And it goes all the way to 102 centimeters long or 40 inches. So again, it's a very sizable total length. But when you compare it to the longsword that we were just looking at, you can see it comes up noticeably shorter. And again, this is a very typical size for what you'd find in many modern dojo, many modern Iaito schools. Iaito would recommend blades of approximately this size. Many bokken are going to be approximately this size. This is a typical configuration for Edo period katana. You can see that the suka is longer and provides more length than that on the longsword, but that the blade is quite a bit shorter than what you find on the longsword blade. Now, for comparison's sake, let's take a look at this Ming blade. Now again, just like we touched on before, in Europe, you had swords of all sorts of different spectrums, starting off from dagger size to short sword size to arming sword size to long sword size to great sword size to two-handed sword size. The same is true in Asia. So in Asia, you have little kind of knife-sized Dao. You have Pei Dao. You have saber-sized Dao. You have big two-handed Dao. And you have huge, oh, I don't have an example here, but you have big field-sized swords that are huge. But the idea is that the Chinese did not come up with this size sword out of a vacuum. This is based on Japanese originals. So, where's my ruler here? Take a look at this. This is now 80. If we measure it as if it were a Japanese sword, this would have a nagasa of 84 centimeters, 33 inches, and a blade reach European style of 87 centimeters or 34 inches. Did I say 33 inches for the nagasa? It should be 33. So 33 or 34 inches, depending how you want to measure it, and a total length of 48 inches or 122 centimeters. Let's compare this one to the European longsword. See how they compare. Uh-oh. Now we are getting much closer. And again, remember I mentioned that the longsword was perhaps a slightly longer than normal example. And you can see at this point we have a lot more grip than we do in the longsword. So if I put them together, pommel to pommel, then we're essentially the same length sword. Slightly more of it is made up in grip than in blade. So is this actually representative of what was going on in Japan during the Ming Dynasty? Is this representative of what we have with longswords during the height of the longsword period, which again we're going to say is maybe the 14th century or so? Let's take a look at the data. Let's see what the actual numbers show us.
Hi guys, this is from the future. In fact, from the far future, because this video has taken quite a bit longer to produce than I expected. It's a result of running into some complications. So what have been the problems when dealing with this type of data? For one, as we kind of touched on, when looking at katana and their total length, there's no good way to account for the loss of the habaki. Oftentimes when I'm collecting the information from databases, we measure just the nagasa, which is not going to include the total length, and trying to find them in their koshirai and have them measured in a consistent way is a little tricky. So that's one thing to account for. Another thing is going to be the definitions. We'll get into that in a little bit since we already talked about definitions previously. And then the other thing is the actual quality of the database that I'm working from. So we're going to look at the longswords first. They came from a project done by Alex Bordas, Great collection of longswords from starting at the end of like the 13th century all the way through the 16th century from a variety of sources, all well researched, including really good collections such as the Wallace collection. However, there were a handful of swords that after I went back and reviewed the data, they didn't have their measurements in line correctly. They made assumptions about a length being, for instance, the total length of the sword, when in fact it was just the length of the blade, and that skewed everything and made some really dumpy sized longswords. So I did a whole lot of work, and then afterwards I had to verify the data and go back and basically do it again. So I'm re-recording this section, and we will just kind of very quickly summarize the findings, and I'll put up some of the graphs as to what's going on. So what type of changes took place over time? In very short, with longswords in Europe, we see a tendency towards increase in blade length over time, starting at around 90 centimeters or so of blade length on average, with pretty wide distributions in each of these groups. So starting in the 13th or 14th century, around 90 centimeters, and then kind of steadily increasing by adding on maybe an additional 5 to 7 centimeters going into the 15th century and ultimately into the 16th century. So each time we move up a different age group of swords, the tendency is for the swords to get longer over time. And these swords do not have a very consistent ratio between their blade length and their hilt length. So you can end up with swords that have very long blades and short hilts, and vice versa. You can have a very long hilt on a reasonably short blade. So there isn't a lot of consistency as to how they are put together. Now, the situation in Japan is a lot more complicated. In some ways, I have more data because I have data going back further. Again, the story of Japanese longswords precedes that of their popularity in Europe, but I also do have missing data, and this is another problem. The time that we're looking at the European longswords, I actually have not as many swords to look at on the Japanese side of things, and it's right around the time that we're transitioning between the Tachi and the Katana in popularity. So you have this kind of weird handoff between which of the long swords is becoming more popular. But we can say a couple of things. In general, if we go back to the Heian period, you end up with these Daito that are pretty long, and they start off in maybe 85 centimeters plus, depending on what we're looking. And again, survivorship bias is a big thing. I have to thank the resources provided by Marcus Sesko, by Token World, by the Tokyo museums that are able to provide the data that I'm able to show here. And these are, in many cases, very nice surviving examples that haven't been shortened, that we can use to get some sense for what the original Tachi sizes may have been, because obviously there are shorter examples, but how big could the really big size ones become? This trend continues into the Kamakura. They may have been very slightly shorter during the Kamakura period than in the earlier Heian era. If so, it's just by a centimeter or two, and in each case is, again, the distribution. We're talking about plus or minus 5+ centimeters of distribution for the majority of the blades that we're looking at that are uncut blades. Now, once we end up in the 14th century and we start to go into the Nanbokucho period, that's where the story gets very complicated, because at this point, there's an interest in making longer and larger tachi, and you'll end up with blades that are 90 centimeters, 100 centimeters, 110 centimeters, 120 centimeters. This is the era of the odachi, of the nodachi, the large field sword. Unfortunately, there is not a really good definition for when a tachi becomes an odachi, a nodachi. There are definitions, but they all kind of come from later periods. They come from Edo periods. People will say, anything that's a blade that's bigger than 3 shaku will be a nodachi. But was that distinction really made at the time? If someone just wanted to get a bigger and bigger and bigger sword and wear it at their hip instead of carry it over their shoulder or carry it on their belt, who's to say? We have some very beautiful, very functional looking swords that were 120 centimeters and that may have been used just like normal tachi. And it's not always clear when one was a really big sword that was intended to be a votive sword dedicated to a temple, or just was a real big sword to show off the craftsmanship of a blacksmith, or to, intimidate a rival clan, saying, hey, we're the guys with the real big, awesome sword. Or it was just someone who wanted a sword that was slightly larger than normal. So in this case, in this particular time period, this rather narrow time period in the Nanbukcho period, we do have swords where the blades starts to exceed that of what we see in Europe at the same time. The question is, where do you want to draw the line and stop calling them hand-and-a-half swords, long swords, and start calling them two-handed swords, the equivalent of Zweihanders in Europe? And that's not an easy thing to say. I don't know enough about it. My Nihonto collector friends, if someone wants to chime in, if they've read anything that might make sense in the context of discussing it during the 14th century, I'm all ears to hear about it. As we go into the Muromachi period, the size tends to drop back down. And again, I was looking really only for examples that were more of the Tachi variety. So as they drop back down closer to 80 or 75 centimeters, that's not looking at examples of Ujikatana. But it's worth noting that this is the time period, even though it's corresponding to the 15th and 16th century in Europe, where we're interested in comparing them to European swords. This is during the Sengoku Jidai, where lots and lots of swords were being produced during the Warring States period. And unfortunately, if we take a look at some of our surviving examples and kind of where they fall, there's just many fewer surviving swords from this period, whether it's because the quality was not as good and so they haven't been retained as art objects, whether it's because they were being mass produced and got used up, or whether they just were repurposed and cut down, or by the time of the end of the Warring State period, during the beginning of the Edo, there were a series of sword hunts that went on, in which case they went out and collected swords from various people who were decided not to allow them. The Tokugawa shogunate decided they wanted to impose rules on not only the sizes of swords, but also who was allowed to bear them. And so several different sword hunts occurred across Japan. And it's possible that this is part of the reason we have this deficit for swords of this time period. So for regardless of the reasons, there's many fewer swords to review in the historical record from this time period, at least that I have access to. And again, anyone who's viewing that has a database of Muromachi era Daito, especially Tachi, but also Ujikatana that are perhaps long, I'm more than happy to read them, especially if they're ubu, if they have not been shortened. But the general tendency is for them to have returned to a smaller size than that from the earlier Nanbokcho period. And certainly that trend continues as we go into the Edo period, where we're only looking at Ujikatana, which originally started from a shorter blade closer to the size of a wakizashi, then grew into a slightly longer blade as it overtook the tachi as the primary longsword. So the last thing that I graphed along with these historical examples was a collection of modern made katana, and you'll notice the distribution is much narrower than what we've been looking at, and it also tends to be quite a bit shorter than these Daito that we've been looking at. So going back to the original swords that we were comparing at the beginning of the video, it's to be expected that someone who's picking up a katana from a modern maker, one that's the size of, let's say, an average bokken that's used in a dojo, is going to be of a shorter variety of sword than these Daito from the samurai time, from the warring states or earlier time. These swords, not always, but certainly could be of a larger size than the Edo period katana that tended to be, 70 centimeters or less in Nagasa. All right, let's go back to in the past.
So, in summary, is a katana shorter than a longsword? Generally speaking, yes, especially because modern-made katana are based on later period swords. The uchi katana, which really became in vogue after the Muromachi period, and certainly once it became more of a civilian setting sidearm starting in the 17th century and running through the 20th century, at which point the blades were quite a bit shorter than the wartime period of the feudal samurai, especially during the Warring Sengoku period. Longswords were enjoyed a pretty popular run. Again, you may have swords that were used in two hands, possibly were in use in Europe as early as the 12th century, but were perhaps most popular during the 14th through 16th centuries. It's difficult to say exactly how big they were. They seem to range in size depending on tradition, depending on regional preference, and certainly it varied with time. On the whole, they tend to be longer than most Japanese longswords, but there were exceptions. And notably in the 14th century, the type of war swords used by Japan tended to be quite a bit longer than most European longswords, especially ones that were popular at the same time. Both Japan and Europe featured larger field swords that were two-handers, which are completely different. They were not worn usually at the hip. They were usually carried on the shoulder or carried by a retainer or someone else. We're not discussing those here. So if you're interested in Nodachi versus Zweihander, that's a completely different discussion and one for a different story. But the longer swords of the pre-Edo Japan had a lasting impact on the surrounding Southeast Asia and China and Korea, and longswords in those countries in part have their origin contributed to the longswords of the 13th, 14th, and 15th century Japan. Okay, so until next time, longswords are cool, katana are cool, and all other swords are cool as well. Take care.